group like Connecticut, you can get industry and unions and environmental groups and peace groups all on board controlling it together and hopefully make some progress. You can do it, as tends to be done, for purely economic reasons, or you can throw in the environmental or the civil liberties and the moral reasons as well. But you can do it. And it's something that it has no downside. It only has benefits. And sadly, I think it really got advanced a couple of years back in Connecticut by this hyped up false pretense that the military spending in Washington was about to get severely slashed, which of course it never was, and it's going up rather than down. But if it takes that sort of pretense or any other sort of mechanism that you're able to take advantage of and get such a thing going, you should. But meanwhile, if you're working for the military-industrial complex, try to find other work. If you know people who are working for it, try to get them to find other work. If you're able to get any sort of big institution, especially educational ones, to take their money out of the military-industrial complex, do it. They're actually, if you have money to invest in, gambling on other people's work and so forth, as the way somebody with no money views investments, there are plenty of funds that will not put your money into the military-industrial complex. They will put it into contractors because just about every company is a military contractor, but go after the local weapons companies. Go after every institution that is part of this machine that is near you and point out that the weapons being blown up in Yemen are U.S. weapons that were given to Yemen, and they're being blown up with U.S. weapons that were sold to Saudi Arabia, and that this is madness, and it has to be stopped, and it can be stopped. We want to buy all the drugs, but get the rest of the world to stop making the drugs, right? Well, we want to build all the weapons, and we expect the rest of the world not to buy them when our State Department has devoted itself principally to being a marketing firm for U.S. weapons. No, we have to stop it at the root of the problem. Comment on what has happened in the general media such that glorification of the military is pervasive. Well, it's not much of a media if we're talking about the corporate media in the United States. And in terms of profit interest, the boards of the corporations are interlocking, and they're interlocking and overlapping with weapons makers and war profiteers of all sorts. They're trading top executives through a revolving door with the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon, and the weapons companies. They are putting on the air people who profit from the military industries without identifying them as such. They are putting on the air generals and so-called war experts and officials who are being paid by the Pentagon and given talking points by the Pentagon and are not identified as such. And it is their vision to maintain access to top government officials. It is their vision to please advertisers. It is not their top interest to inform the U.S. public. And so you have a corporate media that is slanted more and more every year towards war. And the percentage of guests that are on the air that oppose war and in the newspapers that oppose war, it is ever shrinking, ever diminishing, so that studies done by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, for example, found a tiny percent, a handful of a percent of guests in the lead up to attacking Iraq that have an anti-war position. In the debate over Syria more recently, there was a single guest, Fair found, on the big Sunday and other political shows that opposed war. And so you have this debate between use U.S. ground troops and use local ground troops and U.S. bombs, and that's the range of the debate. And you have a big debate about that within that range of opinion, but you don't have the alternatives to war presented at all. And you know, this is the main thing that we could most easily do. If we withheld 10% of what we're going to dump into electing slightly less horrible candidates than the other candidates in the next election cycle and put it into good media, into independent media, we could transform thinking in this country. Because right now we don't have the kind of power that independent media provides. We get an Occupy movement when the New York media chooses to cover the stupid New York police barbarity. We get a movement, a media story about American families when Cindy Sheehan has the luck to show up at Bush's so-called ranch when he hasn't been giving the media that are sitting there in the sun anything to do. So, you know, one thing we ought to be doing as activists is having research teams study where are the media sitting and being bored. Where are the media going to be interested in covering something? I think the people in Ferguson did a great job of putting a story into the media, but we don't have the ability to keep it there. You know, I went to Occupy events 3 or 4 months into Occupy, or just as big events as ever, and people talked to each other about how the Occupy movement didn't exist anymore, right? Because it wasn't on television. It's more real if it's on television than it's, you know, real. And so we have to understand our own power and invest more heavily in good independent media, and you know, stop funding, stop giving the New York Times $50,000 for a page, and instead take that money to produce the kind of video that's going to get 8 million shares on the internet. How do we confront the big money corporate interests and their power? I think I'm going to touch on this somewhat in my speech later today, but these are the problems with the United States compared to other, even less wealthy countries that are ahead of us in education and environment and happiness and lifespan and health and so forth. Is that we have the billionaires, the 1%, and the war powers, which are two very much overlapping groups, and we have to come to see that as the problem to be tackled, and we have to come to see war profiteering and electioneering spending as absolutely unacceptable activities. We have to take the profits out of war, and we have to take the money out of elections, and there are ways that states can take huge amounts of money out of the elections. A state government can forbid corporations from acting without the knowledge and consent of their shareholders and refuse to allow that corporation to spend on elections if it doesn't. President Obama right now is considering, and people are pressuring him, to forbid federal contract corporations from spending on elections without revealing exactly what they're doing. This is federal money being cycled through corporations and back into the federal government in bribes, by another name. These are some of the sorts of partial reforms that we're pushing at rootsaction.org, which is an online group that I work for. But we are going to have to get media coverage that is fair and open to every candidate qualifying by signatures, and the same goes for ballot access and debate participation. We're going to have to ban private spending on elections, make them publicly financed, which isn't much financing once you make use of our airwaves, which we use, which we own for free. We're going to have to end gerrymandering, which states can do. We're going to have to get written ballots on paper counted publicly at every polling place so that we have verifiable international standard elections. We're going to have to reform our entire election system so that we can unelect people. You know, I mean, people have grown so desperate about elections. They want term limits and all of these non-fixes because we've lost the ability to unelect any of these people. They just talk about, we had 47 senators tell Iran that they were going to stay there for life. Who gave them permission to stay there for life? Well, they know that the system is rigged, and we have to unrig it, and it has to be a top priority of a movement that has to include the peace movement, the civil liberties movement, the immigrants' rights movement, the environmental movement, and the movement for self-governance and democracy, which is all one issue. And this is what the Occupy movement got close to producing, was events that didn't segregate these issues as if they were separate. What would further the peace in Syria? What does the peace movement need to do in Syria? Well, I don't know that I'm qualified to tell the peace activists in Syria what to do. I mean, they are living under the threat of weapons, many of them produced in my country. But I think that those who favor peace in Syria have got to stop advocating the violent overthrow of Assad. Not because, man, I got a lot of questions to go through. I'm low on time and there are a lot of questions. I have a lengthy answer to this one at worldbeyondwar.org near the bottom of the page. The question or comment that there will always be war, something we need to give it serious thought. If we can change our opinions on slavery and women's rights, why not on war making? Well, we can, and we have changed our opinions dramatically. And I wrote a book about the peace movement in the 1920s called When the World Outlawed War that lists all the organizations and every religious denomination and church in the country that were all on board with abolishing war, and none of them have rescinded those statements. Any institution, parent-teachers organization, American Legion, I mean everything that has been around for 90 years is on the record favoring the abolition of war. But the culture has changed so that people now think that's a radical position. Well, it can change back the other way, and it needs to. Given the fact that we are so immersed in empire that we don't even see the water, should we pressure the international community to engage in a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against the United States? Wouldn't this be a loving campaign akin to friends not letting friends drive drunk? Yes. What is one argument that works the best for people to grasp the futility of war? I think it depends on the person, and there are lots of arguments. Worldbeyondwar.org is an attempt to make all the different arguments immediately available to people depending on which one they believe in. But I think the fact that it doesn't work on its own terms, that it makes us less safe, and that it creates enemies rather than addressing an existing threat is key. And I think the fact that Eisenhower, for all of his flaws and the other parts of his speech when he left office that I don't agree with, made that point that when you prepare for war and you invest in war and you plan for war, you get war. Somebody snuck in 2 questions. This is a violation here. What is in our culture that young people in the U.S. join ISIS? Well, I'm not aware of any young people in the U.S. joining ISIS. They may, and they may want to if they haven't, but there are young people who've been pressured by FBI agents to join the FBI agents pretending to be ISIS. And I think when you offer people glory and glamour and money and weapons and countless virgins in paradise or whatever they're offering them, and they're alienated and they're unhappy and they're dissatisfied with their current life, they may be inclined to go for it. And when you look at people like Anwar al-Awlaki, who were preaching peace and justice and outrage over 9/11, right after 9/11 in a mosque in Virginia, who then saw all the hatred and racism and the brutality and the injustice of U.S. wars abroad and racism at home and turned against the U.S., there's nothing that can excuse his advocacy for violence, but there is an easy way to explain it. And when you take Iraqis and you throw them in prisons and you brutalize them and you torture them and you humiliate them and you arm them and you let them out into a devastated world divided on sectarian lines and fueled by U.S. weaponry, and then you are shocked that there are new fanatical religious groups on the loose in that territory, you know, you're absolutely crazy. I mean, I think Sean Penn got laughs, right, for giving Dick Cheney credit for creating ISIS, but only because the serious analysts in Washington refused to say it. Dick Cheney did create ISIS. And you cannot fix a problem with the same thing that created it. And you're not going to use war to end war. Do we still have a democracy? No, and we never did. How can we help President Obama go for diplomacy rather than war as he did in Syria? Well, he didn't in Syria. He was dissuaded largely by public opinion from a massive bombing campaign, as Seymour Hersh revealed. But instead, he sent in the CIA and the trainers and the weapons, and he waited around for stronger propaganda. And instead of sending the U.S. in on the side that we had that moral obligation to be on in 2013, or we had to advocate, you know, burning children, we went in on the opposite side. Right? President Obama favors diplomacy when he thinks it makes sense for his war agenda, and he has to be encouraged and praised, and we have to support everything he's doing on Iran in terms of diplomacy, and we have to go after the senators and the Congress members who are out to give war a chance in Iran. But President Obama needs a completely different worldview, and those around him pressuring him need a completely different worldview if he's going to really invest in diplomacy worldwide. And I will answer these later on my website.